The echo of a 6-inch Louboutin heel connecting with flesh silenced the crowded hallway of Manhattan Family Court. Clara, 8 months pregnant, crumpled to the marble floor, her hands desperately shielding her swollen belly. Standing over her, sneering with unabashed malice, was Chloe, the 24-year-old mistress dripping in diamonds paid for by Clara's husband, Richard. Richard, a tech millionaire, merely adjusted his bespoke tie, annoyed by the scene. But as Clara cried out in agony, the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B violently swung open. The presiding judge stepped out, his face turning an ash grey as he looked at the woman on the floor. Richard smirked, ready to buy his way out of the disturbance, completely unaware that the feared, unbribable judge presiding over his divorce was Clara's estranged father. Clara Hastings had given up everything for Richard Sterling. 5 years ago, she was the quiet, unassuming heir to the Hastings legacy, a family of old money, Ivy League traditions, and fierce legal minds. But Clara hadn't wanted a life in the courtroom or the boardroom. She wanted art. She wanted quiet mornings, and to her ultimate detriment, she had wanted Richard. Richard was a self-made real estate tycoon, a man who had clawed his way up from a small town in Ohio to the glittering peaks of the Manhattan skyline. He was charming, aggressively ambitious, and entirely unpolished. Everything Clara's father, the Honorable Judge Arthur Hastings, despised. When Clara announced her engagement to Richard, Arthur had laid out a stark ultimatum. That man only sees your last name and my connections. If you marry him, Clara, you walk out of this family. Clara, blinded by a sheltered girl's rebellion and the illusion of true love, chose Richard. She dropped her maiden name entirely, opting to be known simply as Clara Sterling, cutting all ties with her father to prove she didn't need his wealth or approval to be happy. For the first 3 years, the illusion held. Richard's company, Sterling Holdings, exploded in value, largely due to the quiet, behind-the-scenes investments and strategic advice Clara provided using the business acumen she had absorbed from her family. They moved into a sprawling $25 million penthouse in Tribeca, but as Richard's net worth ballooned past the $50 million mark, his attention shifted. He stopped seeing Clara as the woman who helped build his empire, and started seeing her as a quiet, boring relic of his startup days. Then came Chloe Vanderpump. Chloe was a 24-year-old former swimsuit model turned brand ambassador. She was loud, fiercely entitled, and possessed a ruthless instinct for extracting wealth from older, ego-driven men. Richard met her at a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel and was instantly intoxicated by her unapologetic vanity. Chloe didn't just want a piece of Richard's wealth. She wanted the whole kingdom, and she systematically set out to erase Clara from the picture. The betrayal was discovered on a rainy Tuesday in November. Clara, then 6 months pregnant with their first child, had been experiencing terrible morning sickness. Searching for a charging cable in Richard's home office, she opened his desk drawer and found a velvet Cartier box containing a 3-carat diamond tennis bracelet. Attached was a note, "For my future Mrs. Sterling, last night was magic." Ah. When Clara confronted him, there was no apology. There was no remorse. Richard stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, swirling a glass of Macallan, and looked at her with chilling indifference. "Let's be realistic, Clara," Richard had said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You've let yourself go. You're tired, you're always sick, and frankly, I need someone who fits the image of where my company is heading. Chloe is vibrant. My lawyers will send the papers tomorrow. You have until the end of the month to pack your things." The cruelty was absolute. Richard, utilizing a ruthless legal team led by the notorious divorce attorney Harrison Miller, immediately filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Even worse, he executed a brutal financial freeze. Because Clara had signed a draconian prenuptial agreement, drafted back when she believed love was enough to protect her, Richard legally locked her out of their joint accounts, cancelled her credit cards, and gave her a meager allowance that barely covered groceries, let alone a high-stakes legal defense. Now, at 8 months pregnant, Clara was living in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment in Queens. Her ankles were chronically swollen, her back ached with every step, and the stress had caused her blood pressure to spike to dangerous levels. She had no money for a top-tier lawyer, relying instead on a junior public defender-turned-family lawyer named Jessica Frey, who was drastically outmatched by Richard's million-dollar legal sharks. Clara could have called her father. She had hovered her thumb over Arthur's contact name on her phone 100 times over the past 2 months, but shame held her back. How could she crawl back to the man who had warned her this exact scenario would happen? How could she admit that the man she sacrificed her family for had discarded her the moment she became inconvenient? She chose silence, resolving to fight for whatever scraps of child support she could secure to protect her unborn son. She would face Richard in court, alone. The morning of the preliminary hearing, the skies over New York City were a bruised, heavy, grey, threatening sleet. The air bit through Clara's thin, oversized wool coat as she navigated the crowded subway, desperately clutching a worn leather tote bag containing her financial disclosures. Every jolt of the train sent a sharp pain radiating through her lower back. She arrived at the monumental courthouse at 60 Center Street, climbing the massive stone steps with agonizing slowness. Inside, the grand cavernous rotunda echoed with the chaotic hum of 100 broken families. Lawyers barked into cell phones, couples glared at each other across wooden benches, and bailiffs shuffled paperwork. Clara checked the digital docket board. Sterling v. Sterling, Room 4B, presiding, Honorable Judge A. Hastings. Clara's heart stopped. She stared at the digital letters, her breath catching in her throat. Hastings. It couldn't be. There were other Hastings in New York. There had to be. Her father had been a criminal court judge for a decade. He didn't handle family law. What she didn't know was that a recent political reshuffling in the judiciary, combined with a severe backlog of high-net-worth divorce cases, had resulted in Arthur Hastings volunteering to take on a temporary docket in the family division to clear the overflow. Furthermore, Clara had been filed under Clara Sterling, completely masking her maiden name. To the court clerk assigning cases, this was just another wealthy tech bro discarding a spouse. Before Clara could process the terrifying possibility that her father was sitting behind the bench, the grand brass doors of the courthouse swung open and the paparazzi flashbulbs outside went into a frenzy. Richard Sterling had arrived. He didn't look like a man about to dismantle his family. He looked like a man arriving at a movie premiere. He wore a custom Tom Ford suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly, his dark hair slicked back, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed his money made him invincible. Clinging to his arm like a parasitic vine was Chloe. Chloe had deliberately chosen her outfit to cause maximum psychological damage. She wore a skin-tight, stark white Alexander McQueen dress, a blatant mockery of bridal wear, paired with impossibly high Christian Louboutin stilettos. Around her neck sat a diamond necklace that Clara instantly recognized. It was a vintage piece Richard had bought during their honeymoon in Paris. Flanking the couple was attorney Harrison Miller, a shark in a pinstripe suit, carrying a sleek briefcase that held the documents meant to destroy Clara's future. Clara shrank back against the marble pillar, suddenly painfully aware of her scuffed flats, her lack of makeup, and the exhaustion painting dark purple circles under her eyes. She wanted to turn and run, to disappear into the chaotic streets of Manhattan and never look back. But the heavy weight in her stomach, a sudden reassuring kick from her unborn baby, anchored her to the floor. She had to do this. For him. Meanwhile, behind the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B, Judge Arthur Hastings sat in his chambers, rubbing his tired temples. At 62, Arthur was a man carved from granite. He had a stern, aristocratic face, silver hair meticulously parted, and piercing blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was renowned in the legal community for his absolute lack of tolerance for entitlement and arrogance. He adjusted his reading glasses and pulled the next file from the towering stack on his mahogany desk. Sterling versus Sterling. Arthur sighed, his eyes scanning the preliminary summary. Another Silicon Alley hotshot, trying to starve out the wife who built him, he muttered in a low, gravelly voice to his clerk, a bright young man named David. Look at this preliminary injunction. The husband froze all marital assets, restricted her to a $500 weekly allowance, and is attempting to claim the business is entirely non-marital property. Disgusting. The husband's attorney is Harrison Miller, Your Honor, David noted, wincing slightly. He's requested we expedite the hearing. Wants to push the wife into a settlement today. Miller, Arthur scoffed, a look of profound distaste crossing his face. The man is a legalized extortionist. Who is the wife's counsel? A Jessica Frey, Your Honor. Solo practitioner. This seems to be her first high-asset divorce. Arthur closed the file, shaking his head. He had no idea that the Clara Sterling, listed on the paperwork, was his Clara. It had been 5 years since he had spoken to his daughter. 5 years of stubborn pride, keeping him from picking up the phone. 5 years of secretly monitoring her life from afar, hoping she was safe, but refusing to bridge the gap. He hated Richard Sterling with a fiery passion, but he had never met the man face to face, having refused to attend the wedding. He only knew Richard as a name, a concept, a mistake his daughter made. All right, David, Arthur said, standing up and reaching for his heavy black robes. Let's go deal with Mr. Sterling. I have zero patience for wealthy men who think the law is a tool for domestic abuse. Out in the hallway, Clara's lawyer, Jessica Frey, finally arrived. She looked flustered, juggling 2 legal pads and a half-spilled coffee. Clara, I'm so sorry. The subway stalled, Jessica breathed out, quickly organizing her notes. Listen, Miller just cornered me in the lobby. They're offering a one-time payout of $200,000 if you sign the papers today and waive all claims to Sterling Holdings and ongoing spousal support. Clara stared at her, disbelief momentarily cutting through her anxiety. 200,000. Jessica, Richard is worth 50 million. I designed the initial financial architecture for his firm. I co-signed the loans that kept the company afloat in year 2. That settlement wouldn't even cover a down payment on a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood for the baby. I know, Jessica said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. But Clara, we don't have the funds to drag this out in discovery. Miller will bury us in paperwork until you are utterly destitute. You're due in 4 weeks. You need stability. Before Clara could form a response, a shrill, mocking laugh echoed down the corridor. Chloe had spotted them. Leaving Richard to converse with his lawyer, Chloe strutted across the marble floor, her hips swaying aggressively. She stopped just a few feet from Clara, looking her up and down with an expression of theatrical pity. Well, Chloe sneered, her voice carrying down the hall and drawing the attention of several bystanders. If it isn't the ghost of Richard's past. Honestly, Clara, I thought you'd at least try to look presentable. Is that coat from a thrift store? Leave us alone, Chloe, Clara said quietly, her voice trembling but her chin raised. This is between Richard and me. Actually, sweetheart, it's about me too, Chloe said, taking a step closer, invading Clara's personal space. The cloying scent of an overly expensive floral perfume hit Clara's nose, making her nauseous. I'm the future of Sterling Holdings. I'm the one who stands beside him at the galas. You're just a massive, bloated liability he's trying to write off. Why don't you do everyone a favor? Take the little pocket change Harrison is offering and waddle back to whatever slum you're living in. Jessica stepped between them. Miss Vanderpump, I highly suggest you step back. Harassing my client is not going to look good for your side. Oh, shut up, you discount paralegal, Chloe spat, rolling her eyes. She leaned in closer to Clara, her eyes narrowing into vicious slits. "Richard doesn't care about that thing in your stomach, Clara. He told me himself. He said it was a mistake. Once this is signed, we're moving to the Hamptons, and you're never seeing a dime of our money." A flash of raw, protective maternal rage surged through Clara. For months, she had taken the humiliation, the financial abuse, the silent nights of crying herself to sleep. But hearing this vain, empty woman talk about her unborn child snapped something deep inside her. "Your money?" Clara asked, her voice suddenly devoid of any tremor, ringing with a cold, terrifying clarity that mirrored her father's tone perfectly. "Richard didn't have a dime when I met him. He didn't even know how to tie a Windsor knot. I built that company with him. You are just a temporary accessory, Chloe. A very cheap accessory, despite what you charge him." Chloe's face flushed a violent, ugly red. The smirk vanished, replaced by a contortion of pure, unfiltered fury. No one spoke to her like that. She was used to people bowing to Richard's wealth. She was completely unhinged by the defiance of this pregnant, exhausted woman. "You miserable fat bitch!" Chloe shrieked. Without thinking, driven by a toxic cocktail of entitlement and rage, Chloe lunged forward. Jessica tried to block her, but Chloe shoved the smaller lawyer aside with surprising force. Clara stumbled backward, her hands instinctively flying to her swollen belly. She hit the wall, trapping herself. Chloe raised her leg, the 6-inch stiletto heel aimed directly at Clara's midsection. "Chloe, no!" Richard shouted from down the hall, suddenly realizing the optics of what was happening. But he was too far away to stop it. The heel connected with a sickening, heavy thud against the side of Clara's lower stomach. Clara gasped, all the air rushing out of her lungs in a sharp hiss. The pain was immediate, a blinding, white-hot agony that ripped through her abdomen and shot down her legs. Her knees buckled instantly, and she crumpled to the cold marble floor, a guttural, primal cry tearing from her throat as she curled into a fetal position, desperately wrapping her arms around her baby. The hallway went dead silent. The ambient noise of the courthouse simply ceased to exist. Every lawyer, every client, every bailiff froze, staring in absolute horror at the pregnant woman writhing on the floor, and the mistress standing over her, chest heaving, still wearing a twisted expression of triumph. "Clara!" Jessica screamed, dropping to her knees beside her client, frantically searching for blood, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Somebody get a medic, now!" Richard jogged over, his face pale, but he didn't reach for Clara. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and yanked her back. "Are you insane?" he hissed through his teeth. "Do you know what this is going to cost me?" Before Chloe could formulate a defense, the heavy, brass-studded oak doors of courtroom 4B burst open. The noise had penetrated the thick walls of the chambers. Judge Arthur Hastings stepped out into the hallway, his heavy black judicial robes billowing around him. He radiated an aura of absolute authority and terrifying calm. 2 armed court officers flanked him immediately, their hands resting on their utility belts, ready for an order. "What is the meaning of this disruption outside my courtroom?" Arthur's voice boomed, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. It was a voice that had condemned hardened criminals and dismantled corrupt billionaires. The crowd parted instantly like the Red Sea, creating a clear line of sight between the furious judge and the scene on the floor. Arthur's piercing blue eyes swept over the tableau. He saw Richard Sterling, looking panicked. He saw the young woman in the white dress, looking defiant but suddenly nervous. And then he looked down at the woman on the floor. He saw the oversized, cheap wool coat. He saw the tangled blonde hair. He saw the heavily pregnant belly. And then Clara managed to lift her head, her face pale, streaked with tears, twisted in agonizing pain. Their eyes locked. For Arthur Hastings, the world stopped spinning. The air left the room. The formidable, stoic judge, a man who had not shown a sliver of emotion in a courtroom for 3 decades, felt his heart physically shatter in his chest. It wasn't Clara Sterling, the faceless plaintiff. It was his little girl, his Clara, lying on the floor, weeping, assaulted in his courthouse. "Dad?" Clara choked out, the word barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the hallway, it carried the weight of a thunderclap. Richard Sterling froze. His perfectly manicured hands dropped to his sides. He looked from the weeping woman on the floor to the towering, furious judge in the black robes. "Dad?" The word echoed in Richard's brain, refusing to compute. He looked at Judge A. Hastings. He looked at Clara Hastings. The blood drained from Richard's face so fast he swayed on his feet. The unbribable, ruthless judge presiding over the divorce he had rigged was his father-in-law. Arthur didn't say a word to Richard. He didn't even look at him. The judge bypassed the bailiffs, bypassed the terrified attorneys, and dropped to his knees on the dirty marble floor, his black robes pooling around him, utterly disregarding all courtroom decorum. He gently took Clara's trembling face in his large, shaking hands. "Clara, oh my God, my sweet girl," Arthur whispered, tears instantly filling his stern eyes. "Where does it hurt? Tell me." "My stomach, Dad," Clara sobbed, clutching his sleeves. "She kicked me. Please, my baby." Arthur's head snapped up. The sorrow in his eyes vanished, replaced by a rage so dark, so abyssal, it made the armed bailiffs take a subconscious step back. He looked directly at Chloe, who was suddenly trembling, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. Then Arthur's eyes locked onto Richard. "Bailiff," Judge Hastings said, his voice dropping an octave, turning into a chilling, lethal growl that promised absolute destruction. "Arrest that woman for aggravated assault on a pregnant person and lock down this courthouse. No one leaves." The metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing against the courthouse marble sounded louder than a gunshot. Bailiff Miller, a 20-year veteran of the New York court system who had seen every flavor of human depravity, did not hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing Chloe's wrist and twisting it sharply behind her back. The sudden, violent motion sent Chloe's designer clutch spilling across the floor, lipsticks and credit cards clattering uselessly against the stone. "Hey, get your hands off me! Do you know who he is?" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch as she desperately tried to yank her arm away. She looked wildly toward Richard, her perfectly contoured face contorting into an ugly mask of panic. "Richard, tell him to let me go! Richard, do something!" Richard Sterling stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face had been wiped clean, replaced by the hollow, gaping stare of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. He looked from his screaming mistress to the imposing figure of Judge Arthur Hastings, still kneeling on the floor beside Clara. The realization of what he had done, of who he was trying to destroy, crashed down on him with the weight of a falling skyscraper. He had spent the last 3 months legally torturing the daughter of the most feared, connected, and unbribable judge in the state. Harrison Miller, Richard's high-priced, bulldog attorney, suddenly looked as though he might be physically sick. Harrison had built his career aggressively bullying opposing counsel, but he was acutely aware of the hierarchy of the New York legal food chain. Arthur Hastings was the apex predator. Harrison took a hesitant step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of placation. "Your Honor," Harrison stammered, sweat visibly beading on his forehead despite the drafty hallway. "Judge Hastings, please, this is a massive misunderstanding. My client's associate was provoked. We can handle this quietly. There is no need for criminal charges. Mr. Sterling is prepared to offer immediate medical compensation." Arthur's head snapped up. He gently laid Clara's head against his folded coat, stood to his full, towering height, and turned to face the millionaire and his lawyer. The sheer radiating fury coming off the older man made Harrison actually take a step backward. "Compensation?" Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously soft, a lethal whisper that cut through the cacophony of the hallway. "Or you think you can write a check for assaulting a pregnant woman in my courthouse? You think your offshore accounts and your empty tech valuation mean a damn thing in this building?" Arthur pointed a trembling, wrathful finger directly at Richard's chest. "You arrogant, foolish little boy. I warned her about you. I told her you were nothing but a parasite looking for a host. And the moment she stops serving your ego, you try to starve her out. You bring this violent escort into my courthouse to mock her. Your Honor, please, I didn't know," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. "Clara never told me. If I had known she was your daughter, if you had known, you would have treated her with basic human decency out of fear, not out of love," Arthur interrupted, his disgust palpable. He turned to the officers. "Officer Davis, read that woman her rights and transport her to central booking. She is to be held without bail pending a psychiatric evaluation and aggravated assault charges. And if Mr. Sterling attempts to interfere, arrest him for obstruction." "Richard, you can't let them take me," Chloe sobbed hysterically, her white McQueen dress now stained with dirt from the floor as the officers dragged her towards the elevators. "The paparazzi outside were going to have a field day. Call the mayor! Call someone!" Her screams faded behind the closing steel doors of the elevator, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Suddenly, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the tension. Emergency medical technicians burst through the courthouse doors, rushing a gurney toward Clara. Arthur immediately dropped back to his knees, his judicial authority vanishing, leaving only a terrified father. "Dad!" Clara gasped, her face now the color of old parchment. She was gripping her stomach so hard her knuckles were white. "It's too early. He's not ready. Please don't let him die." "He's not going to die, Clara. I'm right here. I've got you. I am never letting you go again," Arthur promised, tears freely spilling down his weathered cheeks, staining the collar of his pristine white shirt. He grabbed her hand, kissing her knuckles as the EMTs swiftly moved her onto the stretcher. As they rolled her away, Arthur stood up, his black robes billowing. He paused for a fraction of a second, looking back at Richard, who was standing alone, abandoned by his lawyer who was frantically texting on his phone, already plotting his own exit strategy. "I am going to recuse myself from your divorce case, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying finality. "Because what I am going to do to you, legally and financially, over the next 6 months, would be considered a profound conflict of interest. Enjoy your penthouse tonight. It's the last time you'll sleep soundly." With that, Judge Hastings turned and followed the gurney out the doors, leaving Richard Sterling standing in the cold marble hallway, completely and utterly ruined. The chaotic blur of the ambulance ride was something Clara would only remember in disjointed, agonizing flashes. The piercing wail of the siren, the harsh, sterile lights of the ambulance ceiling, the urgent, clipped voices of the paramedics calling ahead to Mount Sinai Hospital, and through it all, the steady, grounding presence of her father's large, warm hand enveloping hers. When they burst through the emergency room doors, a specialized trauma team was already waiting. Arthur Hastings was not just a judge, he was a pillar of the New York establishment. A single phone call from his clerk while they were in transit had ensured the chief of obstetrics and a top-tier neonatal intensive care unit, NICU team, were standing by. "Fetal heart rate is decelerating," a nurse shouted as they transferred Clara to a hospital bed. "She's tachycardic. Blood pressure is 180 over 110. We have a suspected placental abruption from blunt force trauma. Get her to OR3, stat. Prepare for an emergency C-section," the lead doctor commanded. Arthur was physically barred from passing the red surgical line. He stood in the hallway, his hands coated in his daughter's sweat, watching the double doors swing shut. For the first time in his 62 years, the Honorable Arthur Hastings felt entirely powerless. He couldn't issue a ruling to fix this. He couldn't hold anyone in contempt. He could only pace the sterile linoleum floor, praying to a god he usually only invoked during courtroom oaths. Hours bled into one another. Outside, the storm that had been threatening Manhattan finally broke, lashing rain against the hospital windows. Arthur sat in the private waiting area, his head in his hands. He thought about the last 5 years, the stubborn pride that had kept him from dialing her number, the foolish belief that she had to learn her lesson the hard way. He had let a monster into her life because he was too arrogant to offer her a safe harbor when she made a mistake. "Judge Hastings?" Arthur's head snapped up. The lead surgeon stood in the doorway, her scrubs stained, pulling down her surgical mask. Her expression was grave but exhausted. "Clara," Arthur croaked, his voice failing him. "She's in recovery," the doctor said gently, stepping into the room. "She lost a significant amount of blood due to the abruption caused by the physical trauma. We had to perform a transfusion, but she is stable. She's strong, Arthur." Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "And the baby?" The doctor hesitated, a flicker of professional caution in her eyes. It was incredibly close. The boy was deprived of oxygen for a dangerous window of time. He's premature, weighing only 4 pounds, 2 ounces. He is currently in the NICU on a ventilator to help his underdeveloped lungs. The next 48 hours are critical. But he's fighting. Arthur nodded blindly, pushing past the doctor to get to the recovery wing. When he finally walked into Clara's room, the sight broke his heart all over again. She looked so small amidst the tangle of IV tubes and monitoring wires. Her face was bruised from where she had hit the floor, and she was pale, but her eyes fluttered open as he approached the bed. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with painkillers. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here," Arthur said, pulling a plastic chair flush against the bed and taking her hand. "My baby. Where is he?" Panic spiked in her monitors, the rhythmic beeping accelerating. "He's in the NICU. He's safe, Clara. He's got a whole team of doctors watching him," Arthur soothed, stroking her hair. "He's tiny, but he's tough. Just like his mother." Tears leaked from the corners of Clara's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Dad. You were right. You were right about Richard from the very beginning. I was so stupid. I threw away my family for a man who didn't even see me as a human being." "No, no, stop," Arthur hushed her, his own tears falling freely now. "The failure was mine, Clara. I am your father. My job was to protect you, whether you asked for it or not. I let my pride get in the way of my love for you. I left you vulnerable to a predator. I will spend the rest of my life making that up to you, I promise you." They wept together in the quiet hum of the hospital room, 5 years of estrangement washing away in a tide of shared grief and renewed love. While the Hastings family began to heal in the quiet sanctuary of the hospital, 30 blocks south, Richard Sterling's world was exploding. The paparazzi footage of Chloe Vanderpump being dragged out of the family court building in handcuffs, screaming hysterically, had hit the internet within an hour. The headline on a major tabloid site read, "Tech Bro's Mistress arrested for assaulting pregnant wife in court." Richard sat in his cavernous Tribeca penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of a city that was currently tearing him apart. His phone had not stopped vibrating for 3 hours. Investors were calling. Board members of Sterling Holdings were demanding an emergency Zoom meeting. His PR team was frantically drafting statements, trying to figure out how to spin the unspinnable. "You're a liability, Richard," his lead PR director screamed through the phone. "The optics on this are apocalyptic. You starved out your pregnant wife, and your new girlfriend literally kicked her in front of a judge. The board is talking about triggering the morality clause in your contract to force you out as CEO." "They can't do that. I built this company," Richard yelled back, hurling his crystal scotch glass against the wall, shattering it into 100 pieces. "You built it, but you don't own all the voting shares," the PR director snapped, and word just leaked about who the presiding judge was. "Arthur Hastings. Do you have a death wish, Richard? You need to settle this divorce tomorrow. Give her whatever she wants. 50%, 60%, the penthouse. Just make it stop." Richard ended the call, his hands shaking. He pulled up his banking app. He had millions, yes, but his wealth was tied up in stock real estate, and leveraged assets. If Clara took half, and the board forced him out, the resulting stock plummet would wipe him out entirely. He needed to talk to Clara. He needed to manipulate her one last time, to remind her of the good years, to play on her sympathy. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the private elevator, heading for Mount Sinai Hospital. When Richard arrived at the maternity ward, he marched toward the reception desk, utilizing his best authoritative CEO voice. "I'm Richard Sterling. I need the room number for my wife, Clara Sterling." The duty nurse typed the name into the computer, her expression turning immediately cold. She recognized him from the article she had just read on her break. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. The patient is listed as Clara Hastings, and she is a restricted VIP. She has explicitly denied you visitation rights." "I am her husband. That is my child in the NICU," Richard demanded, slamming his fist on the counter. "You cannot keep me from my family." "Actually, Mr. Sterling, I can." The deep, resonant voice came from behind him. Richard spun around to find two massive, broad-shouldered men in dark suits wearing earpieces. They weren't hospital security. They were private executive protection. Behind them stood Arthur Hastings, wearing a fresh suit, holding a cup of terrible hospital coffee. The judge looked rested, calm, and utterly terrifying. "Judge Hastings," Richard started, instinctively taking a step back. "I just want to see my wife. I want to apologize. I want to make this right. You lost the right to call her your wife the day you handed her a $500 allowance while buying blood diamonds for a violent escort," Arthur stated flatly, taking a sip of his coffee. "You're not going near her room. You're not going near the NICU. If you take one step past this desk, these gentlemen will physically remove you, and I will personally file a restraining order that will prevent you from coming within 500 feet of my daughter or my grandson for the rest of your miserable life." Richard swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the absolute authority of the older man. "You can't keep my son from me." Arthur stepped closer, invading Richard's space, lowering his voice so only Richard could hear. "Watch me. You thought you were playing chess, Richard, but you weren't even on the board. Go back to your empty penthouse. Wait for the lawyers. Because when I am done with you, you will be lucky to afford a studio apartment in Staten Island." Richard looked at the two massive bodyguards, then at the steel gaze of the judge. He turned on his heel and walked away, the first true tendrils of pure terror wrapping around his heart. 72 hours later, the tide began to turn. Little Arthur "Artie" Hastings, Clara had immediately dropped the Sterling surname for her son, was finally breathing on his own in the NICU. He was tiny, a fragile bundle of wires and fighting spirit, but his vitals were stabilizing. Clara, though still confined to a wheelchair as she healed from the traumatic surgery, spent every waking moment sitting by his incubator, reading him classic literature in a soft, soothing voice. While Clara focused on life, Arthur focused on war. True to his word, Arthur officially filed his recusal from the Sterling versus Sterling divorce proceedings. The case was immediately transferred to Judge Penelope Albright, a notoriously strict, no-nonsense jurist who had been mentored by Arthur 20 years prior. Albright had a well-documented history of dismantling husbands who attempted to hide assets in high-net-worth divorces. But Arthur didn't stop there. He knew that Jessica Frey, Clara's young public defender-turned-lawyer, was out of her depth. He didn't fire her. Clara liked her, and Jessica possessed a genuine, scrappy loyalty. But he brought in the heavy artillery to lead the charge. Enter Victoria Kensington. Victoria was a legend in Manhattan family law. She charged $2,000 an hour, wore exclusively vintage Chanel, and possessed a legal mind so sharp it could cut diamonds. She was terrifying, brilliant, and owed her early career success to a recommendation from Judge Hastings. When Arthur called her, she dropped her caseload and arrived at his private study within the hour. "Arthur," Victoria had said, pouring herself a glass of his best bourbon, "I read the preliminary filings. Harrison Miller is an idiot. He drafted this prenuptial agreement on the assumption that Clara would never have the resources to challenge it. We are going to rip this apart." The war room was established in the library of Arthur's Upper East Side townhouse. For 2 weeks, while Clara remained at the hospital with baby Artie, Victoria, Jessica, and a team of forensic accountants ruthlessly dissected Richard's financial life. What they found was a staggering web of deceit, narcissism, and outright fraud. "Look at this," Jessica said late one Thursday night, sliding a highlighted ledger across the mahogany table to Victoria. Richard claimed that Sterling Holdings' new algorithmic valuation model, the proprietary software that bumped their company valuation by $30 million, was developed entirely post-marriage by his engineering team. Victoria adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes scanning the data. And, Jessica grinned, pulling out a faded, spiral-bound notebook Clara had retrieved from her apartment before going into labor. Clara designed the foundational architecture for this algorithm during their honeymoon. She handwrote the logic chains. I cross-referenced the dates. Richard took her intellectual property, gave it to his coders to polish, and patented it under his sole name. Victoria let out a low, predatory whistle. Intellectual property theft between spouses. This completely bypasses the prenuptial agreement. It proves the marital asset isn't just shared. It was generated by the plaintiff. Meanwhile, the forensic accountants hit the jackpot regarding Chloe Vanderpump. Judge Hastings, the lead accountant said, presenting a series of wire transfers. We found dissipation of marital assets. 6 weeks before Richard filed for divorce, he transferred $4 million from a joint corporate account into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. That shell company then purchased a condominium in Soho and 3 pieces of high-end jewelry, all deeded to Chloe Vanderpump. Arthur, sitting in his leather armchair, steepled his fingers, his eyes gleaming with a cold, terrifying satisfaction. Fraudulent conveyance. He deliberately hid marital funds to starve Clara out. Exactly, Victoria smiled, closing her laptop with a sharp snap. Harrison Miller is going to have a heart attack. I'm filing an emergency motion for a complete freeze on all of Richard's personal and corporate assets by tomorrow morning. He won't be able to buy a cup of coffee without my signature. While the legal noose was tightening around Richard's neck, Chloe Vanderpump was discovering the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. She had been sitting in the women's wing of Rikers Island for 2 weeks. The reality of her situation had systematically stripped away her vanity and arrogance. There were no silk sheets, no room service, and absolutely no respect for her Instagram following. She wore a drab orange jumpsuit, her platinum blonde hair was a tangled, greasy mess, and she was terrified. Richard had abandoned her. After the disastrous PR fallout, his corporate lawyers strictly forbade him from having any contact with Chloe. He hadn't sent a lawyer, he hadn't posted bail, he hadn't even sent a message. She was a liability he had discarded, just as he had tried to discard Clara. When the heavy steel door of the visitation room clanged open, Chloe looked up, expecting to see a public defender. Instead, an impeccably dressed assistant district attorney walked in, flanked by a detective. "Miss Vanderpump," the ADA said, sitting across from her, "you are facing a Class B felony for aggravated assault on a pregnant person, resulting in severe bodily harm and premature labor. You are looking at a minimum of 10 to 25 years in state prison." Chloe burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "Please, I didn't mean to hurt the baby. I was so angry. Richard told me she was a monster. He told me she was trying to ruin us. Richard Sterling manipulated you," the ADA said smoothly, opening a manila folder, "just like he manipulated the tax code. We have reason to believe Mr. Sterling used the shell company he created for you to evade federal taxes. You are listed as a managing director of that LLC, Miss Vanderpump. That makes you an accessory to wire fraud and tax evasion." Chloe's head snapped up, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. "What?" "No, I just signed the papers he put in front of me. I don't know anything about taxes or shell companies. He said it was just a way to buy the apartment privately." The ADA leaned forward, tapping his pen against the metal table. I believe you, but a jury might not. Unless, of course, you decide to cooperate. Cooperate how? Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. We want everything, the detective interjected. We want access to the encrypted text messages between you and Richard. We want you to testify that he instructed you to sign those fraudulent documents. We want you to testify about the $4 million he transferred out of his marital accounts. You give us Richard Sterling on a silver platter, and the DA's office will reduce your assault charge to a misdemeanor, recommend probation, and grant you full immunity on the financial crimes. Chloe sat in silence for a long moment. She thought about the cold cell upstairs. She thought about the man who had promised her the world, only to leave her to rot the moment she became inconvenient. The last shreds of her loyalty evaporated, replaced by the same ruthless self-preservation she had always possessed. She wiped her nose on the sleeve of her orange jumpsuit, her eyes hardening. Give me a pen. I'll tell you absolutely everything. 6 months had passed since the brutal incident in the Manhattan family court. The icy grip of New York winter had thawed into a crisp spring, mirroring the profound transformation within Clara Hastings. Stepping out of a black town car in front of the courthouse, Clara wore a sharply tailored midnight blue suit. Her blonde hair was styled in an immaculate blowout, and her posture was steel. Beside her walked her father, Arthur Hastings, radiating a quiet, lethal confidence. Nestled safely in the arms of a hired private nurse behind them was little Artie, now a thriving 6-month-old who had long surpassed his fragile beginnings in the NICU. Inside courtroom 3A, the atmosphere was suffocating. Judge Penelope Albright, a woman whose stern reputation rivaled Arthur's, sat behind the heavy mahogany bench. At the defendant's table sat Richard Sterling. The past 6 months had aged him a decade. His custom suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his arrogant smirk was entirely gone. His empire had been bled dry by the temporary asset freeze Victoria Kensington had brilliantly orchestrated. Investors had fled, Sterling Holdings' stock had plummeted, and the board had placed him on indefinite leave. Next to him, attorney Harrison Miller looked like a man preparing for his own execution. All rise, the bailiff announced. Be seated, Judge Albright commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. We are here for the final settlement hearing in Hastings v. Sterling. Given the extraordinary circumstances and parallel criminal investigations, I expect absolute efficiency today. Miss Kensington, you have the floor. Victoria Kensington stood up slowly. Thank you, Your Honor. We are here today to formalize the dissolution of this marriage. However, we are also here to expose a staggering campaign of financial fraud, intellectual property theft, and economic abuse perpetrated by the defendant, Richard Sterling. Harrison Miller jumped to his feet. Objection. Opposing counsel is using inflammatory language to bias the court. Overruled, Judge Albright snapped instantly. Given the evidence Miss Kensington submitted to my chambers last night, Mr. Miller, you are lucky I haven't sanctioned you for submitting a fraudulent prenuptial agreement. Sit down. Victoria walked gracefully towards the center of the courtroom. The defendant claims that the core algorithmic valuation model of Sterling Holdings is entirely his non-marital asset. However, Exhibit A demonstrates otherwise. She handed a bound dossier containing high-resolution scans of Clara's spiral-bound notebook to the bailiff. My client, Clara Hastings, is the sole architect of the logic chains that built that software. We have time-stamped metadata proving she uploaded the architecture months before Richard handed it to his engineering team. The defendant stole his wife's intellectual property, patented it under his own name, and built a $50 million valuation while simultaneously freezing her bank accounts to starve her out. Judge Albright examined the documents, her lips thinning. If the core IP belongs to the plaintiff, the entire valuation of the company is subject to redistribution. It gets worse, Your Honor, Victoria smiled. Because the defendant didn't just steal from his wife, he stole from the federal government. The plaintiff calls Chloe Vanderpump to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as Chloe walked in. She was no longer the diamond-draped mistress. After months of cooperating with the district attorney under house arrest, she wore a conservative grey dress, keeping her eyes averted from Richard. After being sworn in, Victoria approached her. "Miss Vanderpump, can you describe your relationship with the defendant leading up to the events of November last year?" "I was his girlfriend," Chloe answered softly. "He told me he was leaving his wife and that we needed to protect his money. He set up a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Vanderpump Holdings LLC and made me the managing director. 6 weeks before he filed for divorce, he wired $4 million into that account to buy me a condo and jewelry." "Objection! Hearsay!" Harrison shouted, his voice cracking. "Your Honor," Victoria smoothly interjected, pulling a thumb drive from her pocket. "We have the fully decrypted text messages between Mr. Sterling and Miss Vanderpump, provided willingly by the witness. In these texts, Mr. Sterling explicitly outlines his plan to use this shell company to hide marital assets and evade capital gains taxes." Judge Albright looked at Richard with utter disgust. "The objection is overruled." Richard turned to Harrison in a panic. "Do something. You told me the Cayman accounts were untraceable." Harrison packed his briefcase, snapping the latches shut. "You lied to me, Richard. You perjured yourself and implicated me in a fraud scheme. I am withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately. Good luck." Harrison stood up and briskly exited the courtroom, leaving Richard entirely alone. Victoria returned to her table. "Your Honor, based on the insurmountable evidence of fraud, IP theft, and extreme abuse, we ask the court to completely invalidate the prenuptial agreement." Judge Albright nodded slowly, looking down at the broken man before her. "Mr. Sterling, in my 25 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered such profound arrogance and malice. You attempted to financially ruin the woman who built your empire. You failed." She picked up her gavel. "I am hereby invalidating the prenuptial agreement in its entirety. I award the plaintiff, Clara Hastings, 100% ownership of the proprietary algorithm, effectively transferring controlling interest of Sterling Holdings to her. Furthermore, I award the plaintiff full, sole, legal and physical custody of the minor child. The defendant is stripped of all visitation rights." Richard buried his face in his hands, a pathetic sob escaping his throat. He was ruined. "But we are not finished," Judge Albright added, looking toward the back of the room. Two figures walked forward, an assistant district attorney and a lead detective. "Richard Sterling," the detective said, pulling out steel handcuffs, "you are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and perjury. Place your hands behind your back." The metallic click of the handcuffs sounded like poetry to Clara. She watched the man who had tried to destroy her get hauled to his feet and marched out. Clara turned to her father, who wrapped his arms around her in a tight embrace. "It's over, sweetheart," Arthur whispered. "You took it all back." "No, Dad," Clara smiled, looking at baby Artie. "We did it." 3 years later, the Manhattan skyline glittered outside the windows of the new Hastings Technologies headquarters. Clara sat at the head of the boardroom table, a formidable CEO in her own right. She had rebranded the company and turned it into an industry titan. On weekends, she, Arthur, and Artie were an unbreakable unit. And Richard? He was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, spending his days scrubbing cafeteria floors, completely forgotten by the world he had once tried to conquer. What a spectacular, heart-pounding fall from grace. Richard Sterling learned the hard way that arrogance and greed are no match for a fiercely protective mother and the relentless power of a scorned legal dynasty. Clara's journey from a terrified, financially abused wife to a triumphant CEO is a testament to the fact that true wealth isn't just in bank accounts. It's in the strength of family, resilience, and knowing your own worth. The twists, the courtroom drama, and that satisfying final checkmate prove that karma always collects its debts. If this intense tale of betrayal, revenge, and justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please like this video, share it with your friends who love a brilliant comeback story, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping real-life dramas. Don't forget to hit the bell icon and comment down below. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes?